Hi, I'm Alan Langham, and this is the Hero's Journey podcast. The heart and vision behind this podcast is to see the captive set free. For those who are hurting, those who feel alone, those who feel ashamed, the topics that we're going to be covering are going to be the ones that most people don't go into. But for me, as a young man suffering at the hands of bullying and beatings and abuses, the bereavement and death of my mother, the absent father, homelessness in London, drugs, alcohol, addiction, prison life, it just takes its toll. And at times can leave you in such a negative, horrible space, which for me was the point of suicide. I've featured on many other people's podcasts and articles and videos and different things, but this is the time where I share my story for me. Growing up, it was quite a hard upbringing. We didn't have a lot of money. Just as a little baby, my dad had stepped over me, packed his bags and left. And when I was told that memory as a young boy growing up that the person who was my father stepped over me, it did damage that even now I've only just got to a place of comfort and peace around. That catalyst made me just so angry towards someone I didn't even know. And it didn't even make sense to have such anger and hatred towards somebody I never met. But that is the consequence that as dads and fathers and male role models that we can have such a damage effect on the people that we leave behind through choices. Around the house, for me, I always had that bit of fear. Every time I went out of the house and onto the street, the older children picked on me and called me names and physically assaulted me day after day after day. And I kind of got used to just being a victim, to being frightened and to being scared. That lost little boy just wandering the streets, just trying to find some safety. I found safety just hanging around in the woods and all those places where, I could just be alone and just try and work out why people didn't like me. I used to take off up into the woods and pretend I was a sergeant major in the army and play the games of Huckleberry Finn watching that on telly. And I had a dog called Lassie that used to follow me everywhere, and me and her would just wander off. And one of the most profound beatings that I received is when I was given the news that Lassie had been put to sleep, and I got out my little penknife and cut all my mattress up and was beaten quite heavily with a high heel shoe. And for me, that had become a kind of norm in response to, my behaviours. So growing up was very mixed. There was a lot of love poured out onto me, a lot of beautiful people who went above and beyond to try and make my life more special. But when you've got broken people looking after broken people, looking after more broken people, the only result can ever be brokenness. And, sometimes you can be born into a family dynamic that is just broken. And it's not a fault of them. They can only live the life that they have before them. And unfortunately, sometimes those decisions and those incidents that can happen in life could quite often be so detrimental to those that they genuinely love. As I started to become a teenager, one of the most traumatic experiences of my life was coming down the stairs and finding my mum dead on the settee after hearing the screams of my sister screaming mum's name. And the living room door had quite a distinctive sound, and as that door opened, I heard the scream, and I think I already knew inside somehow because I just had this weird feeling inside and came running down the stairs and, screamed, "Mum!" And as I did that, I gently thought I saw her eyes flicker. So I went running over and put my hand onto her neck, and It was the coldest feeling I've ever experienced in my life. And I came running out of that room and started kicking the door and smashing up the kitchen and crying and hysterically. And one of my neighbours came round. He was ex-army, and he grabbed me by the shoulders. He said, "Young man, dry your tears. There's women present. Be a man." And I think that day, something changed significantly in me. As one, that I never expressed any emotion again for a lot of years. And two, those tears dried and I became very hardened. And I generally believe that that's where a ball of rage started to erupt in my life. Following that, I just went downhill so fast. The home that I knew and trusted and the place of security for me had been snatched and taken away from me. And, I went to live with my sisters between their two households. And even though they poured all their love and energies into me, at no point did I feel that I was part of the home. My home had gone. And it took a long, 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 long time before I ever felt at home anywhere else. And over those next few years, I had kind of started to grow up too early, too fast. I didn't go through normal teenage stuff and just be a teenager. For me, it was this hole left inside, this deep wound of pain that fermented every time I even thought about anything to do with my mum or anything like that. It just became unbearably painful, and anger started to build. At school, I certainly just wouldn't pay any attention or do any of the work, even though I could. And it became quite apparent to me early in those years that people were scared of me when I fought back, when I hit back, when I became violent. And I went from being the bullied to the bully, to the intimidator, to the violent guy, to the person who would, sadistically get, a kick out of seeing people cower away because it gave a form of power that I'd never been accustomed to. So I started to fight more and more and started to get into more and more trouble. And in the midst of all that, I excelled as a professional rugby league player. And how that was even possible, and even to this day, I don't really know, because, that game to me was an escape. It was somewhere where I could just let all this pain and hurt, just let it out on the pitch. And I suppose I played just as a ticking time bomb, as a young man who was just going to explode all the time, and it was legalized violence. And I suppose because of all that pain and hurt and mistrust and betrayal and rejection and this memory of being stepped over and being told that your dad played rugby and all these things. So I started to create, as a child growing up and into an adolescent and as a teenager, these fantasy, futures or fantasy kind of worlds where things were normal and I wasn't a scruff, or I wasn't, walked over. I had a mum and a dad. I had a normal family. And I think that later on in life, that certainly became, high-level mental health of delusions. But I'll come back to that. That's a completely different story. But at 17 years old, just 3 months after following the sudden death of my mum, I signed a professional rugby league contract. It was Super League One, the pinnacle of rugby league. I signed for Sheffield Eagles. I got a few £1,000s, bought an A-Reg Orion, put a Pioneer sticker in the back of it, a pull-out stereo, went with my friend. We'd come back with a check. I went to the cash and check place, cashed it, and went out, to the nightclub and partying. And that became a theme really for me, is that even though I'd signed a professional contract, I didn't have the discipline or the understanding of how to live as a professional person. And really and truthfully, I was a mess. And having this money and this kind of, oh, wow, he's a professional, I kind of puffed out my chest and thought, yes, I'm great, I've made it, I've achieved my goal that I set as a 12-year-old to be a pro rugby player. I'd done it. I was around all the pros. There was 8 Great Britain internationals in that squad. Gary Everington at the time had signed me, and, I kind of thought I was it. But I was just craving family, craving to be needed and wanted. And in that, I had formed a group of friends who we were all just collided together, just a bunch of broken messes, and they had become my family. So their problems became my problems. I was the tough one of the group, so I seemed to be fighting other people's battles, and it had become quite, relevant that I was good at fighting, and started to fight more and more. And as we got older and started to get more into going out and into the pubs and the clubs and the nightclubs and that kind of party lifestyle, that, unfortunately the violence also kind of rose with that, which inevitably made it, inevitable that that kind of life is going to have a negative effect on a professional contract. And it soon did, within less than a year's time. They called us into a meeting at the club and said, look, any disrepute on the club, that's it, your contracts are over. A couple of the players had been sentenced to prison for racing each other in the cars on the M1. The club had just bought them new cars, and I kind of just shrunk there and thought, oh no, because I knew I had a court case pending that, inevitably I was going to be looking at prison. And that's what happened, is that I walked into that court in my suit, a professional rugby player, 18 years old, full of life, full of opportunity, full of desires, full of dreams, full of these goals, and was sentenced to 8 months, which started the decline into the criminal underworld, as I was sentenced to an 8 months prison sentence in a young offenders institute. And from that period, spent the majority of the rest of my adult life in and out of prisons on a 20-year cycle and a revolving door of prisons, drugs, violence, selling drugs, beating people up, getting beat up, getting kidnapped, being hit with bats, hitting people, harming people, selling drugs, an addict, clean, in prison, out of prison, on probation, off probation, in court. This cycle just kept on and on and on, from a choice at 18 years old to have a fight in a nightclub, sticking up for a friend. Crazy, crazy how just one decision can be so instrumental in the downfall of somebody who, on paper, has the world at their feet. But professionalism is about character, discipline, organizational skills, training when the others are going out, resting and doing your gym and doing your diet and nutrition when the others are going out drinking. But I just joined the overseas players and partied and thought, because I had the talent, it didn't matter. I could still play decent with a hangover. I could still go out and perform on the pitch. But what could have happened if I'd have actually been disciplined and organised and structured and focused on the talent that I was given? And how many years I've regretted those decisions. How many years I've looked back and thought, why did you do that? And sometimes that can be counterproductive, because if you're looking backwards, with such regret, you miss what's in front of you. And this, for me, is what this is all about. What this podcast is about is that even in those crazy situations, even in those times when we made these stupid decisions, that good could come from it. I always say, there's purpose in brokenness. There's always a purpose within it. And it's like, people say, what do you mean by that? And what I mean is that even in the depths of despair, in the lowest places that you can ever be, when you look back on that further down the line, you can actually see how that grew you as a person, how that shaped your decision making, how that enabled you to reach out a helping hand to others. And this is what the hero's journey is about, is helping other people to see that even through the mistakes, even through the poor choices, even if you've been a prisoner, an addict, a prostitute, whatever it is that you've done, that there can be purpose within that, that hope is possible, that success is possible. You know, if you ask, 10 children, what's a hero? 9 will say, a football player. But that one will say, my grandpa, my uncle, that one person who stood up and recounted when everybody else wasn't there for them. And they're the type of people that to me are heroes. The ones who have just made it through life, no matter what adversity has come at them. I'm far from a hero, but my journey and the steps that I've had to take to overcome what has been in my path in life has enabled me to have a heart to help other people through their stuff. It's enabled me to see the pain and destruction of the world. It's enabled me to understand abuse, be it physical, mental, emotional, sexual, the beatings that people received, through the trauma that people have had to experience to get to where they've got to. I don't know anybody who has, success in life who hasn't been through adversity. Adversity is the thing that shapes and strengthens. It equips and molds in order to make a difference in your life and in other people's lives. So, I don't want people to think that, I've never done anything in life, so I'm not a hero. But to that one person, you could be the everything. And that's what's key in this, is that, there's a big emphasis, on the superstars and the celebrities and all that kind of stuff. But if you were to scratch the surface, those that have made successes, they've got some pains in there. They've got some hurts. They've got some betrayals. They've got some letdowns. They've got some anxieties, some fears, some insecurities, and the stuff that drives them to try and survive just another day. For me, as a recovering addict, following my professional rugby league contract at the age of 19, I'd been in prison twice, lost my rugby contract, and I was taking heroin in prison, thinking it was just another drug. I'd been in prison now, a few months, and tried to fit in with that and make family from the guys in prison. And, I think some of the prison tales is something that, we'll be sharing and talking about, because, there is some humour in that, but there's anybody who has been in prison, they know at that first day when that door shuts that you'll flop on that bed and you cry. I don't care who you are or what you are, that's what you do. And, it's that for me, I think, started the mental issues that I suffered as a man. I generally believe, and I go out on a limb and say I believe, that every prisoner, just from the environment itself, suffers from PTSD from the environment, because of the hostility of it, the danger of it, the violence of it, the threats of violence, the noises, the smells, and the survival instinct that you have to put on to survive, especially when you're going into a strange environment. You're locked up with somebody for up to 23 hours a day who you've never met. You have to live in such a confined space with somebody who you might not agree with, you might not get on with, you might certainly not like. And it's a degrading system. And I think that's the design of it, to strip you of who you are. And unfortunately for me, that worked. I was stripped of my dignity, stripped of my self-respect, stripped of my self-esteem, stripped of the career that I had, stripped of family members who obviously didn't want to be part of someone's life who was a criminal and in and out of prison, and I understand that. Stripped me of my opportunity to be a father to the children that I went on to have further down the line. There's no glitz and glamour of the prison life. It starts that way, and then you'll see people with the money and the cars and the women and all that goes with it. But believe me, 20 years down the line, there's not many that are still standing there. They're either dead, they're either in prison, or they've come away from it. Thankfully, I took the latter decision to come away from that life, and made that decision, over 11 years ago. And if I had not made that decision, I'd have took my own life. 2008, Father's Day. I'm ringing and ringing my friend. I haven't been able to get hold of him for 2 days, and it was completely out of character because we were meant to be meeting it was something silly, but we were meant to be getting some radiators and he never let me down in all our life. I knew that there was something not right, and I rung round a couple of people, and oh no, it's all right. His 4 before was down at the house. He was a millionaire, a cage fighter. I had everything that you would think would be successes. But when I arrived at his house and kicked his door off and run around the house looking for him because I knew something was seriously wrong, when I found him in his bedroom, slumped in a corner with his throat cut, an inch thick, congealed blood, and his own wee and poo, sat there in the mirror as he'd looked at himself to find the jugular to cut his own throat, that does something to a person. The destruction of the end of his life and witnessing that was a catalyst for me to have to make some changes. And people for years asked me over and over again about why did he do it? And I could never really answer that question. I had all these surmisations, and at first, what was the most awful thing that I could experience from that is that because I came out the house in blood, and the kind of rumours in the estate, that I'd done it or I'd been part of it, and you're kind of having to navigate through that foolishness, as well as, the police want to take a statement, and all you want to do is just go to oblivion and drink and get out of your face just to avoid that memory of that scene. But I think for me, it was a pinnacle defining moment. Stood on the top of those stairs with a scene of horrendous suicide behind me, and then the steps in front of me, and it was as if, like in my whole life kind of passed before my eyes of finding my mum on the settee, and it were kind of like those two images kind of interlinked periodically. But following my mum's death, all the stuff that I did wrong and the way I'd never dealt with it and trapped up this emotion and let that ferment as anger and hurt and pain and started to become aggressive and violent. I think in its own way, this was the opposite, where it was if the bravado was knocked out of me and I was this so-called, hard case criminal type gangster guy stood on these stairs just like a little boy, just completely lost again and just wanting to go and break down and process what I'd just seen. But again, that came back, be a man, don't cry, don't show emotion. Kind of started to whisper into me, and I came down the stairs, and then there's people there, and, I had to slip into kind of the mode of, right, let's get all this sorted out and be proactive, and, that wasn't the truth of it. I was broken. This was my closest friend. This felt like my right arm had been taken. And the worst thing is, we all knew. We all knew he was struggling. We all knew that he couldn't face it. We all knew that he was, in a bad place, but none of us did enough. I'd had a heart-to-heart with him about it all, and, just a couple of months before when he'd made these promises he would never do anything and all this stuff, but I knew he weren't right. And all he wanted really was he was a gentle giant. you know, the cage fighting and the violence and all that other stuff that went with it, that would just image and the glitz and glamour of the world wrapped around a broken person. And I have to live with the pain and the regrets of knowing that one of our friends took his own life because he didn't have the ability to speak to one of his friends. And that just takes some comprehension. I've lost count of the amount of friends now that have took their lives in this last 5-6 years. There's a pandemic of men killing themselves because they can't talk about their emotions. They can't let go of the male ego, I must be tough, or I can't even put it into the right context, you know, that we've just got to talk and say, look, I'm struggling. And thankfully, I hope that from this podcast and from this type of stuff that men can reach out and say, I'm struggling. And they can get the help that they need and the support that's available in the need. It's like, you know, and the observation that I have on all this is that the majority of people who support men's mental health is actually women. It's like, you know, I see it all over social media and all these places where, you know, new groups are being set up and it's the women who are kind of the driving force behind it. And it's like, that really speaks to me on a real level, because I think, you know, wow, people do care. And it's like, if my friend could have saw his own funeral, which is, you know, obviously it's a weird thing, but me personally, every time I've gone to a funeral, I've always had that drifting thought about my own, you know, how many people will come and all that different types of stuff. But, you know, there was thousands of people who came to that funeral. We carried his coffin through the streets of our area where we grew up, you know, and he lived at the bottom of a hill. So we had to climb up the hill with this big cage fighting guy, and you know, we had a good heavy casket, him and probably half a dozen of the toughest men of our area, you know, the bald heads and, you know, physiques. And we started to walk, and it was just an eerie silence, and we were just like talking to one another. Come on, yeah, let's get him home. And, you know, you're trying to hold back the emotion, but you know, you've got these tough guys who are walking that walk with you. And for me, the hair stood up on the back of my neck throughout the village, because the streets were lined with people. The police had blocked the streets off, and we walked him up through the streets and walked him home. But unbeknown to us, because obviously we're at the front, there's just thousands of people behind him. And for someone who feels completely alone and feels that there's no one to turn to or to talk to or whatever else, how fitting is it that someone who has this process of mentally, that there's no one there, or there's no one to speak to, has all these thousands of people who would have, each one of them probably give him an ear. So I don't want anybody ever again to ever feel they can't shout out. They can't share their vulnerabilities. They can't say, look, I'm struggling. Because what the alternative doesn't even bear thinking about, and it's just imperative that men start to talk, that men start to show emotion and trust that people do care, that people do listen, that people do want to be part of that. You know, I've seen the worst of life and I've seen the best of life. I've had the roller coaster journey, which, you know, is all going to be unpacked and unpicked as we start to go on this process of and sharing some of these topics, you know, the things that have happened to me, the things that I've done, the being part of, you know, the criminal world, being part of professional sports, being as a young person, as the man that I am today, you know, the relationships and problems that I've faced along the way, you know, getting access to my children and going through all the assessments to enable that to happen, you know, and also bringing in people who are my heroes. You know, the addict that made it, the prostitute that's come off the street, the broken heart that's been mended, the inspirational person who has, you know, made a difference to many people's lives, the unsung people, the ones who are not who you would deem a hero in the world standards, but in the standards of what this feature's about and what this podcast's about is, you know, is they're the heroes of my life. They're the people that inspire me to go another day. They're the ones who I see those journeys in people and the redemption that comes over those lives. I see that daily, and I'm so honored and humbled to be part of people's lives who allow me to minister into their lives, into their broken parts, into those places of despair and destruction. For me, that is an honor that you can't put any kind of value on other than to see that transformation. It's just beautiful. One of my friends over in America says, Alan, the power is in the telling. And it's the story. This is my story, you know, told my way, with my voice and my heart, to enable other people to see the hope, the opportunity, and the understanding that no matter what, there is the chance of a new and transformed life. You don't have to suffer in silence anymore. You don't have to cry into that pillar and feel alone and abandoned. You don't have to be rejected by those who love you the most. There is chance to get your children back in your life. There is chance to get off the drugs, the alcohol, whatever vice it is that you're going through. If you're trapped in the cycle of prisons and the criminal system, that you can get out of that. And that's what I want to share through this podcast, is what hope is available, what opportunities are available, but most of all and fundamentally, what it is that your story can do for others.